be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You know, you want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, you know, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. That's what I'm writing about now. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful because, well, beauty calls people to their higher being, I would say, and to make friends with beauty is to introduce yourself very carefully to one of the mysteries of life that make it worth living. And so those are a few of the rules that didn't make the original cut, but historically you have to say that we're in good times. I mean, that doesn't mean everything about the current times are good, and of course life is always tenuous and difficult, but it's 1919. If you go back 100 years ago, imagine what the last 5 years would have been like, right? The entire world was encapsulated in a terrible war. The trench warfare was absolutely brutal, and that was a 5-year period, and then that was followed by the Spanish influenza, which killed 120 million people. And, you know, so I'd rather be here now than there then by a substantial margin. And I think life is never easy, even under relatively positive conditions, but I would say that it's very difficult to make the case that we're not in good times. And I especially think that's true if you look at the world globally. The American working class, and maybe the Western working class in general, paid a very large price for enriching the rest of the world. You know, I mean, China's come up in a miraculous way in the last 40 years. South Korea, India, while the entire, in all of Southeast Asia, and increasingly Africa too, because the fastest growing economies in the world are now in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's produced a tremendous competition for working class people in the West. But speaking on a global level, there's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then, you know, maybe things can continue to improve. The rate of absolute poverty in the world has fell by 50% between the year 2000 and the year 2012. You know, that's the fastest rate of economic improvement in the history of the world, and there's plenty of reason to be optimistic if you're inclined in that direction. I would say it's best to marry that with a healthy dose of attentive caution because, well, as I said, things can go badly wrong, but I can't think of a time in the past that I would trade for now, despite all the problems that are also part and parcel of being alive now. I think there is a certain danger in luxury. You know, we don't know how necessary a certain degree of privation is to motivation. You know, the typical first generation immigrant story is someone arrives with nothing and is motivated fully to do whatever is necessary to make either themselves or their children a success. And that does seem to decline, that motivation does seem to decline somewhat over the following generations. So, for example, Asian immigrants, their children outperform American children in school by a substantial margin, but that disappears by about 3 generations, that advantage. Asian immigrants become more Americanized, their proclivity to excel academically.
You guys understand that concept? Powerful. So I come first generation, I'm more disciplined. My kid becomes less disciplined. My grandkids become less disciplined. And the one prior to that, past that also gets less disciplined.
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, and you probably face this to some degree because, you have a lot of resources at your command. It's very difficult to provide your children with optimal privation in order to make them stand on their own 2 feet.